Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at the extent that media and communications technology affects identities. When we talk about a globalizing or a globalized world, one of the things that makes this possible is technology. If you think about what technology means, you might think of something like your phone, right? We carry a supercomputer in our hand. We watch TV made from places around the world. We have access to all these different medias and technology in many different ways. Now, is this the same for everybody across the world? No. So how does this affect our identities? Here's a cartoon. It looks somewhat comical at the beginning. I want you to take, though, maybe pause the video and look at this for a minute. Answer these questions. What do you think? Is this serious? Is it funny? What message is being depicted here by the author of the cartoon? Again, let's use our analysis skills. If we start with explicit information, we could look and see that there are numerous logos. Coca-Cola, Disney, we got Mickey Mouse, Donald, and Goofy. Texaco, big oil company. The Windows logo, so for Microsoft. Shell, Nike, McDonald's, Motorola. Now, what is happening here? Why would companies want to invade another country? When we're looking at a source such as this, remember we're looking for the perspective of the author. Some of it's quite clear. We have, comical childhood characters carrying guns, and you have an indigenous population looking scared and, well, they're held captive. Why would a company go to another country? Well, one answer would be to expand your market. If you've reached the market in your country, well, if you want to make more money, you have to expand. So here is somewhat more of a critical depiction of globalization. The first thing we're going to look at is what's called the digital divide. Now, what is the digital divide? This is essentially people who either have access or do not have access to modern information technology. So things like telephones, televisions, and the internet. The internet is probably the one we would be most concerned with in 2020 because you can use it for television and telephones. So why might access to technology impact an individual's interaction with a globalizing world? Well, even right now, as we are doing some lessons online, how would this look for somebody who does not have internet access? Can they partake in these lessons? Can they watch these videos on YouTube or Google Classroom? No. That's an example of the digital divide. Now, if we take a look at the map that's presented here, this is the percentage of a population who is able to use the internet or has internet access. So ranging from the dark blue, 90 to 100% of the population, down to 0 to 9%, so under 10. As you can see, the world is not even when it comes to access to technology. Even a country like Canada is not in the 90 to 100% range. So more than 10% of Canada's population does not have access to the internet. There are some parts in the world where this is below 10, and there's a vast or significant portion of the world, especially when we consider how many people live in this section of the world here in Asia. There's a lot of people who don't have access to technology. This is significant. Let's take a look at this website for a minute. It has a couple other interesting charts. So worldwide internet users from 2005 to 2014, just under a billion. Well, there's more people now. It's 2020. So about a billion more people. But let's look at the percentage of people not using the internet. So it's gone from 84 to 60. Or we could say how many people are using the internet and it's gone from 16 to 40%. That's a significant increase in the amount of people who are using the internet. That's great. However, it's not 100%. It's not perfect. How does this impact somebody's life? You need to think about, like, well, what do I use technology for? Maybe it's for communication, maybe it's for learning, but how many jobs are is the internet a requirement for? And that seems like kind of a silly question coming from like our perspective here, but how many jobs would use a computer? Right? Countless employment opportunities. So if you do not have access to the internet, well, this puts you in a very distinct disadvantage compared to a lot of the world. This is just for us to see the access to technology is growing, but a lot of people do not have the same access. Now, media consolidation and convergence. Here's something that has changed over the past few decades. Media convergence is when a lot of what we consume is controlled by only a few transnational companies. So, because of convergence, the world now has fewer independent media companies. If we look at the image on the right, in 1983, 90% of American media was owned by 50 companies. Fast forward 3 decades. In 2011, that same 90% of the media is controlled by only six. So you can see the six companies and some of the things they own, their subsidiaries. How does this shape what you consume? I mean, you'd ask, where is most of the media coming from? Well, it's coming from just a few companies. So you might ask yourself, is this going to give me many opinions, or is it going to limit the amount of opinions and perspectives that I consume? A lot of people would say this limits the amount of perspective. So, how are you getting a realistic image of the world? Well, it's for you to maybe think about. Obviously, this list has changed. For Disney, they've now bought out, Star Wars as well. So some of these are huge companies. Here's another image depicting this. Who owns the big TV networks? Essentially, what this is showing is that just because you watch a TV channel doesn't mean it's independent. Most of the time, they're owned by someone else. And just like in any chain of management, you're responsible to the people at the top. Canada is very similar. We have a lot of like media ownership. Things like our newspapers are owned by only a few different companies. So again, you can ask, what is this doing for my perspectives that I'm being given? Here's some of Canada's media empires. CanWest Global Communications, Rogers, CTV Globe Media, Quebecer Media. You can look through here and see, what do they own? Watch this link from my slides that I post to give you an idea of what it means to be controlled by other companies and what that does for opinions. Now, in Canada, we have regulations. The CRTC, Canadian Radio, Television, and Communications Commission. This is a significant regulatory body in the country. Now, prior to this slideshow, you should have watched the clip about Bryan Adams. For some of you, you might not have heard of him. He's a little older now. But then you should have defined some of these terms already. So it should make a little more sense. The CRTC, what do? They regulate and supervise all aspects of the Canadian broadcasting system. So here are talking about things like what music you hear on the radio, what TV shows you see on TV. So they establish how much Canadian content must be broadcast in Canada. So we use the term CanCon, Canadian content, easy to remember, and the CRTC is deciding how much Canadian content is going to be on the airwaves or the radio waves. There are regulations. For example, radio stations must play 40% Canadian artists. Now, that's a fairly significant percentage. If you were to write down a list of your top singers or bands or rappers that you like, I would be curious how many of those were Canadian and if it would be 40%. What this means, though, if you're listening to a radio station, so you can think of some of the local radio stations, 40% of what they play during a day has to be Canadian. Now, being Canadian, like or CanCon, you do not get this just by being born in Canada. You have to meet other regulations as well. So this brings us to the Maple system. To qualify as Canadian content, a musical selection must generally fulfill two of the following conditions. Now, what a fitting acronym to be Canadian, right? Maple, but it's also an easy to remember one. So, music, artist, performance, and lyrics. For music, we mean the music composed entirely by a Canadian, the artist. So, in this image, I have Justin Bieber. So, is the music or lyrics being performed principally by a Canadian? P. Performance. The musical selection consists of a performance that is either recorded in Canada or performed and broadcast in Canada. And then lyrics, written entirely by a Canadian. Now, the reason we use the Maple system in Canada is because, again, let's use Justin Bieber as an example because his picture is here. He's born in Canada. Well, to make an album, you have to record somewhere. Let's imagine Justin Bieber is recording in Los Angeles. Well, that's not Canada. Maybe the person who wrote the lyrics for his song was somebody from the United States. And maybe the person who made, let's say, his beat was also American. Well, the only thing Canadian about it now is the fact that a Canadian is performing it. And so that Maple system would not characterize that as CanCon. The Bryan Adams example is useful because he was a huge Canadian star, but also worldwide. He had a big song that was not considered CanCon. And what would an advantage be to being considered CanCon? One thing that might pop into your mind is that you might get more airplay. There's times when you'll be listening to the radio and you might hear a radio host say something like, "We have to fulfill our CanCon requirements, so here's this song." Well, maybe you don't like that song, but the quota has to be fulfilled. Let's take a quick look at the top musicians on Canadian and American charts and how they compare and contrast. So I'm going to click up here. This is Music Canada. Now there's different charts, but these are the top 20 albums of this week. I'm just going to scroll through here. One thing I want you to look at though is how many of these individuals are Canadians? The Weeknd is Canadian, Gordon Lightfoot. Some of these names I don't know. Bieber. But most of these that we're seeing here are Americans. Do you think that's going to be comparable in the States? This is Rolling Stones. So the Weeknd is number one there. So a Canadian is number one on the charts. Then as we scroll down, it's basically all Americans. Bieber's there again. So one thing you'll often see is that on the Canadian charts, there are more Canadians. And again, this is because in Canada, There's the quotas. So, what are some arguments for quotas? Well, if you're a Canadian musician, it's going to be very difficult to compete against Americans. It's a bigger country. Their like recording industry is well established. So how do you compete with Americans? Again, if you were to make a list of all the people you listen to, there's a good chance most of them are not going to be from Canada. So how do we give Canadians a chance to compete in this media stage? Well, by doing things like these quota systems, you're giving Canadian artists a chance. Now, Brian Adams said what you do is you breed mediocrity. Mediocrity means something's not great. And so his criticism was that by having these quota systems, you essentially don't let the market decide. You know, if you're good, you're going to be listened to no matter what. Maybe that's true. However, and if we think of something like a television show, how is a Canadian actor going to break into Hollywood? It's going to be difficult. You have to get you have to get a visa, all these other things. But if you give Canadian TV a chance, well, you're going to now support that industry. Maybe it is mediocre, maybe it's not, but you're giving Canadians a chance. So that brings us to the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. A little bit of their history. Essentially, the federal government established a commission to advise on the future of broadcasting in Canada. They started CBC television in 1951. What they noticed was that Canadians were listening to American radio and in large numbers. Now, you can come up with whatever opinion on Canadian identity you would like. Maybe you think that's good. However, for a lot of people, Canada is a sovereign country. So why should the majority of what we consume come from another country? How is that doing us any good? So the CBC or the government decided the CBC will be made to promote Canadian content, Canadian news, Canadian TV shows. So by the 60s, the CRTC established as the regulatory and licensing authority, and in 1968, the new Broadcasting Act confirmed CBC Radio Canada's role of providing the national service. So they had a national duty. CBC is recognized as one of the country's greatest cultural institutions. Not everybody thinks this, but they've become a leader in producing and distributing distinctive Canadian content. Now, CBC is owned by the federal government, therefore, we call it a crown corporation. So, they're also a major developer of Canadian TV shows. But since they're a crown corporation, their funding, where is it going to come from? Well, from a lot of it's going to come from the government. Now, this is 2015, but the CBC received just over $1 billion from the government, and this is after taking a funding cut the previous year. This just gives you an idea of how much money they're getting from the Canadian government. They also make money from revenue sources include taxpayers, subscription fees, advertising, and other revenues such as real estate. Take a quick look at CBC TV shows. Now, I'm not going to read every single one of these, but you can scroll through this and you can see there's a lot of Canadian TV shows. And again, would these people have opportunities if there was no CBC? Well, that's a good question. Most of these you can watch for free on CBC Gem, which is a streaming service for CBC shows. But there's a big debate. Should the CBC be kept public or should it be privatized? Now, what might be a benefit to privatizing it? Well, you now free up some money that's being sourced from taxpayers to do something else with. That's a fairly strong argument. For example, if you do not watch CBC, you might feel like your money shouldn't be going to it. Well, that's fair. What about it being kept public, though? Well, you're producing Canadian television. This gives Canadian actors and actresses and screenwriters and producers and directors, etc., etc. It gives them jobs and they're creating stuff in Canada by Canadians. But a lot of people think it should be privatized. There's other TV channels in Canada that are used to reach different audiences. As we've seen, technology does not mean equal access across the planet. And oftentimes what we see is things like American movies are spread the most. So, how do you reach smaller minority groups? Well, one of the channels that was created is the Aboriginal People's Television Network. This is the world's first national Aboriginal television network with programming by, for, and about Aboriginal peoples. So they offer news, entertainment, sports, children's programming, and they also program in many different languages. So this is one of those opportunities that globalization has given in the sense that minority groups in Canada actually have media that is tailored to them. Without some of these things, you're going to have a limited, you know, amount of perspectives given to you. For francophone culture, we have TV8, Canal Savoir, and TV5. These are some examples of French language networks that broadcast in Canada. So this is a way for French speakers to be connected around the world. Now, some of you might have noticed when you're flipping on the TV, you might flip onto a French channel. Well, this would be because of these. And again, giving minority cultures media as well. So there's many challenges and opportunities presented by globalization. We're seeing fewer media outlets because of the amount of media convergence going on. But we also see some quotas and cultural protectionism put into place. Now that reminds me, cultural protectionism is not something that is limited to Canada. Many countries practice some form of cultural protectionism. Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Europe, France, Indonesia, Israel, Korea, Malaysia, Singapore, South Africa, Ukraine, Venezuela, Vietnam. So many countries want to try to keep the exposure to, let's say, American media to a smaller percentage. And so by using these quota systems, they're trying to give local programming a chance. Technology gives us these opportunities, but it's also in the face of challenges. However, we do see many opportunities.